Ó, um vídeo que muita gente pede pra gente assistir, na verdade não é bem um vídeo, né, mas é um tema. Um tema que muita gente pede pra gente assistir, falar sobre, é sobre George Orwell. Uma parada que aparece muito assim, vem sempre, né, perguntas a respeito da obra dele e tal. E aí, me mandaram um vídeo faz algum tempo já, em que uma pessoa muito especial aparece em um vídeo, né, explicando ali, né, as origens do pensamento, quem foi George Orwell e tudo mais. É um vídeo que está em inglês, né? A gente vai assistir ele com a legenda traduzida do automático. E eu não vou falar quem é, vocês vão ter que assistir, né, para poder saber quem é. Então, antes de começar, né, não se esquece, né, de comentar quem você acha que é a pessoa especial que vai aparecer, hein? Eita, Lelê! É, George Orwell, né? Jorge Bolacha, vamos lá.
Literally 1984. Hi there. Did you know that Orwell was just an all-around horrible human being? Well, he was a horse rider, which really is the major issue with him.
Ele era não é horse rider, ele era worse rider, tá?
If you didn't know, George Orwell was a snitch, a racist, a colonial cop, and a CIA puppet, whether knowingly or unknowingly. His "it's okay to leave your nephew with me" mustache is only the cherry on top.
Que isso, caralho. O bigode pode deixar o sobrinho comigo, que isso, porra.
First, about the man himself. The son of a British colonial officer from a wealthy landed family, he began his career as a British imperial official in Southeast Asia, basically a colonial cop. He was a little conflicted by his role, but not out of a conviction against the evils of imperialism and colonialism, but because the, and I quote, yellow faces, as he called them, didn't look kindly at him. In the end, the sneering yellow faces of young men that met me everywhere, the insults hooted at me when I was at a safe distance, got badly on my nerves. Who would have guessed that being an occupier wouldn't get roses rained on you? His entire write-up basically drips of hatred for the local Burmese, as well as a backward logic where imperialism wasn't bad solely because of the processes that made it up, but because the colonized expected a certain attitude of a colonial official that Orwell himself found difficult to fill, apparently.
E aquela coisa, né? Só para poder relatar, a Birmânia, né, era uma região que era controlada pelo imperialismo britânico. E era bem comum, né, que vários oficiais, várias pessoas do Império Britânico no geral ocupassem esses cargos, né, como oficiais e coisas assim, diferentes locais ao redor do mundo, né?
Let's quote the man some more, shall we? All I knew was that I was stuck between my hatred of the empire I served and my rage against the evil-spirited little beasts who tried to make my job impossible. He repeats this pattern often, says something incredibly racist, but turns around with a, "Oh, but I don't really like empire all that much either." Between uninspired and
Agora, por que o Lenin tá aí?
unconvincing prose about disliking empire, though he still found it quote-unquote respectable, whatever that means, he falls with, "I thought that the greatest joy in the world would be to drive a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts."
Eu achava que a maior alegria do mundo era de... Não é dirigir, né? Mas é tipo... Drive é tipo ir pra frente, né? Uma baioneta nas entranhas de um sacerdote budista. Ah, essa é a foto do perfil do canal do Hakim, entendi, pode crer.
Mighty authoritarian of you, Eric. Hold on.
Bem autoritário é bom, né? O homem anti-autoritarismo aí.
If he hates the Burmese and uses these terms, then surely a self-proclaimed socialist would have even harsher words for the most notorious fascist of all, right? Let's have a look. I should like to put it on record that I have never been able to dislike Hitler. I have reflected that I would certainly kill him if I could get within reach of him, but that I could feel no personal animosity.
Okay.
The fact is that there's
então é isso, né? Mataria e tal, mas eu pessoalmente tô de boa, assim. Eu pessoalmente tô tranquilo. Ah, entendi.
something deeply appealing about him. One feels, as with Napoleon, that he is fighting against destiny, that he can't win, and yet that he somehow deserves to. Jesus fucking Christ. The simplest benchmark for any reasonable human being is to have a burning hatred for fascism. But apparently, even that's too much for Orwell. Instead, in the
Tadinho, ele é tão de centro. Ai, ele é tão de centro.
height of World War II, he says the willingness to criticize Russia and Stalin is the test of intellectual honesty. Yes, echoing many a reactionary and liberal in red paint we see today. That's not to say that one shouldn't criticize, etc., etc., but there's a time, place, and format where it's most constructive, if your criticism is good faith to begin with, and the middle of a fascist takeover of Europe and beyond isn't it. See my video on left-wing anti-communism for more about this perspective. Let's move on to his list-making. Orwell reported on his friends and acquaintances to the Information Research Bureau, a dedicated organization within the British government founded in order to publish anti-communist material and fight revolutionary, anti-colonial, and pro-independence movements. This
Inclusive, né, essas várias organizações, elas se repetem não só na Inglaterra, né, mas em vários lugares. Existia até o Comitê de Ações Anti-Americanas, né, que foi aquela organização criada durante a época do macartismo que vai perseguir uma galera que era considerada comunista e subversiva, né, incluindo o próprio Oppenheimer, o elaborador da bomba atômica.
Office not only got the rights to Orwell's works, but also directly translated and published
Peraí, vamos voltar aqui no tradução essa parte.
anti-communist material and fight revolutionary, anti-colonial, and pro-independence movements.
E movimentos
This office not only got the rights to Orwell's
Esse escritório não somente tinha direitos
works, but
às
also directly
obras orais,
translated
mas
and published
também...
Animal Farm and his other garbage works into 20 languages on every continent.
Ou seja, era um monopólio editorial feito por uma agência governamental britânica cujo objetivo era combater movimentos revolucionários que causassem instabilidade no Império Britânico. É um think tank.
On Earth. In fact, Orwell's entire literary reputation is due to direct CIA and other anti-communist organization efforts at popularizing his nonsense, which is telling because his work on the face of it really is unimpressive. Regardless, back to the list. He lists Paul Robeson, arguably one of the most famous people of the past century, airbrushed out of history because of his communist leanings, as very anti-white, a Wallace supporter, in his snitch list, with zero evidence either in reality or within his deluded mind, aside from a typical racist presumption that wanting non-whites to be treated like human beings must mean you hate all whites as well. He
Isso, né? Zero surpresas, né? Que surpresa.
diligently notes Jew and Jewess next to people many times incorrectly in a time where European Jews had just faced the Holocaust.
Nossa.
Deutscher, Polish Jew. Dryberg, Tom, English Jew. Chaplin, Charles, Jewish? My God, why is this so important to you? It makes you think. He also kept a paranoid list of names for himself, by the way, with the same weird pattern reproduced. Some liberals like to pretend that the lists were only to prevent these people from working for the Secret Service, but naivety is a liberal pastime, and so is absolute faith in nefarious institutions like the IRB, which played a significant role in things as diverse as the Suez Crisis and the Troubles. Why you wouldn't want people who could sabotage the propaganda efforts of an empire you supposedly hate so much, I have no idea, but it is telling. You'd also have to be incredibly gullible to think lists of leftists, anti-colonial figures, minorities, etc. were done in good faith and for a good purpose.
Aquela coisa, né? Curiosamente, essa lista aqui de detratores e pessoas que de alguma maneira são ameaçadoras, segundo a lógica geral, curiosamente são todos de lutadores esquerdistas, né? De anticoloniais, etc, etc, etc. Gustavo, você acha que alguma obra do Orwell tem algum valor de análise ou algo assim? Não. Ah, merda, pô. Ah, merda. Literariamente falando, é uma bosta. Não tem que reivindicar nada.
Regardless, as a liberal darling, all of his obvious ignorance and suspicion of Jews, LGBT people, and blacks is skated over without a peep or mention. Had any other post-war leftist made remarks of this kind, you'd for sure know about it, and their problematic nature would litter the prefaces of their published works. Yet, no mention. Liberals are so intentionally blind that they claim his attempted rape of his adolescent girlfriend was a quote-unquote botched seduction, in which she had shouted, screamed, and kicked before running home with a torn skirt and bruised hip. Yes, that's apparently a botched seduction.
Caralho. Eita. A botched seduction. É isso, né? É isso. É igual umas outras galeras aí, né? Umas outras galeras aí que eventualmente viajam, né? Enfim. E que defendem o Orwell, né? E que inclusive adoram citar George Orwell, né? Ai. Será que essas mulheres são fáceis? Será?
To liberals when a 190 centimeter tall man corners and forces himself onto a tiny 150 centimeter tall woman. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. Virtual both right uses as Atlas VPN. His support is highly appreciated. Alright, back to the video. That's not it though. Arguably, his magnum opus, Animal Farm, was written in 1943 and 44, yet not a mention or room in his mind for condemning fascism as it was ravaging Europe, with the only power at the time actually kicking Nazi Germany's teeth in being the Soviet Union, which he spent the entirety of the war as well as his life condemning and satirizing. At the same time during the war, the IRD, which he would work for, was making
o IRB, né? O instituto que ele trabalhava e que traduzia as obras, não o terceiro.
Connections with Ukrainian nationalists, of which many directly aided the Nazi Einsatzgruppen as they went about their program of a mono-ethnic Ukraine without Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and communists.
Uau! Parece a Ucrânia de que época? Apoiada por quem? Ah, olha só! E quem vai pra lá? Pra ajudar no esforço de guerra ao lado das tropas ucranianas? Quem que vai pra fazer coquetel Molotov? Ah!
There's even evidence to suggest that Orwell knew
Não, só um tarado pra ir nesse lugar, né?
and approved of this. To quote a great article you should read, Isaac Asimov also points out a shocking fact that conveniently escapes the myriad disciples of the British author. George Orwell spent the peak years of genocidal destruction of World War II writing a childish story about how evil the Nazi-killing Soviet Union supposedly was. As Asimov points out, Orwell
Asimov, né? Isaac Asimov.
wasn't much affected, apparently, by the Nazi brand of totalitarianism, for there was no room within him except for his private war with Stalinist communism. Consequently, when Great Britain was fighting for its life against Nazism, and the Soviet Union fought as an ally in the struggle and contributed rather more than its share in lives lost and in resolute courage, Orwell wrote Animal Farm, which was a
Orwell escreveu o Revolução dos Bichos, né? Esse é o nome, não é? Mas o nome original é Animal Farm.
satire of the Russian Revolution and what followed, picturing it in terms of a revolt of barnyard animals against human masters. He completed Animal Farm in 1944 and had trouble finding a publisher since it wasn't a particularly good time for upsetting the Soviets. As soon as the war came to an end, however, the Soviet Union was fair game and Animal Farm was published. In fact, Orwell went out of his way to manufacture a fantasy that couldn't possibly be mistaken for Nazism, because, as everyone knows, the people and ideology that materially supported every single genuine liberation and independence movement in existence are the true evil. Of course, not a single line critiquing American genocidal policies globally, or their constant warmongering and saber-rattling, and their sanctions and bombing of poor third-world countries trying to detach from colonial regimes that had oppressed them for decades if not centuries, nothing on the Spanish or French or Portuguese. His only genuine vitriol and whatever passed for criticism, oscillating between childish storytelling and verbose ranting, was exclusively reserved for socialist countries, and specifically the USSR.
Então, num contexto desse, né, em que a gente tem a ascensão do regime salazarista, franquista, a ascensão do regime fascista italiano, do regime fascista alemão, da continuidade do colonialismo britânico, do colonialismo francês, da intervenção imperialista dos Estados Unidos na América Central e no Caribe, o direcionamento da crítica do cara é a só uma organização, só a um país. O que isso significa? Que, de alguma maneira, ele tem um subterfúgio que ele apoia dentro do movimento colonizatório. É isso, o Orwell é um pensamento do colonizador. É um pensamento que é um pensador, né, que foi patrocinado, que foi fabricado para poder servir como propaganda na Guerra Fria, como propaganda anticomunista. É isso. Concreto. É isso. Simples assim. Simples assim. E para você poder tirar a dúvida, né, basta você ver qual tipo de menção que o Orwell faz ao colonialismo britânico, ao fascismo. Nenhum. Nenhum.
A country he never visited, never read about, and never interacted with the politics of. This point can't be understated. Orwell actually knew next to nothing about the USSR, and the misconceptions and ridiculous caricatures he reproduces both in his writing.
Não é à toa que esse livro faz tanto sucesso no senso comum, porque ele foi escrito por um idiota, né? Ele foi escrito por um Zé Mané, um pulha colonialista, e cujas únicas fontes de informação eram o próprio senso comum. Não faz surpreendente que faça sucesso no senso comum.
As well as his commentary are so easily corrected by the lightest possible research as to essentially solidify the fact that he was simply happy in his ignorance. Or insidious, one or the
Ganhando
other.
dinheiro pra
By the way,
caralho,
if you thought
porra.
Animal Farm critiques Stalinism or whatever other made-up concept, it doesn't. The fundamental thesis of Animal Farm is that the working class is stupid and cannot be trusted to lead any sort of independent political existence.
É, e é muito louco, né? Ó, quem vem aí?
To quote Jonas...
O quê? Quem veio aí? O quê? Citado.
Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel.
Veio aí? Veio aí?
Manuel, a Brazilian organizer,
Urano Manuel. Urano Manuel.
professor of history. Orwell spends the entire book describing generations of animals as easily confused, dumb, stupid, illiterate, amnesiac, the entire book. The main target of this book's critiques aren't revolutionaries or communism, it's the working class.
Olha que foda essa análise, né? É uma análise que a galera geralmente não faz, né? Que o Orwell retrata a classe trabalhadora como o burro de carga, porque é assim que ele vê o trabalhador, como um burro de carga, né? Alguém incapaz de tomar decisões, de pensar por si, né? Olha aí quem chegou ao
George
homem.
Orwell writes from an aristocratic ethos. Elite theory posits the people as incapable of self-governance, without the capacity to constitute themselves as a political subject, and therefore always the object of dispute and manipulation by vying elites. The people lack the capacity for political self-determination, cannot build a political program or engage in autonomous political action. This is George Orwell's theory, borne out by his choice of metaphors. Animal Farm isn't a critique of revolutionaries reactionaries, it's a critique of workers. It's an aristocratic manifesto against the working class.
E é sobre quem esse vídeo?
Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel. Jones Manuel.
Tá?
This book, Animal Farm, is a deeply reactionary book, displaying aristocratic condescension against the people, a book in which the working class appears as imbeciles. It displays all the marks of the bourgeois genre of elite theory, its historical metaphors for Soviet history, whitewashed capitalists and imperialists. The USSR is shown as self-sabotaging while its enemies are completely absolved. This is George Orwell and is why he was so successful. I highly recommend you read the article. It's great and full of citations to further bolster the point. I don't want to subject you to excerpts of Animal Farm, after all.
Ainda indicou o artigo, hein? Bom demais.
Was even noticed by the people who fought beside and absolutely hated Orwell in Spain. 1984, on the other hand, doesn't even deserve to be commented on. To quote Asimov again, I read it and found myself absolutely astonished at what I read. I wondered how many people who talked about the novel so glibly had ever read it. Or if they had, whether they remembered it at all. I felt I would have to write the critique if only to set people straight. By the time 1984 came out in 1949, the Cold War was at its height. The book therefore proved popular. It was almost a matter of patriotism in the West to buy it and talk about it, and perhaps even to read parts of it, although it is my opinion that more people bought it and talked about it than read it. For it is a dreadfully dull book, didactic, repetitious, and all but motionless. I generally recommend you read this.
Né, a literatura indicada pela torcida do Criciúma.
Entire review as well. The critique is excellent and really goes to show not only how bad the book is, but also how the literally 1984 types don't even bother to engage with the book. And of course, the incredibly ineffectual and childish criticism of vague or otherwise undefined symbols of power. Keep in mind though that Asimov himself is a liberal at the end of the day, so some of his politically oriented comments suffer the usual deficits. Of course, the elephant in the room, that Orwell would love to shoot, is his supposed leftist convictions. To quote a fantastic article from Red Sails, it is mistaken to imagine that children in the English-speaking world get Orwell's work drilled into them like a mantra because somehow genuine socialists managed to sneak his work past a censor that banishes the likes of Karl Marx and Malcolm X. From the beginning, this supposed socialist had published everything he could in a personal crusade against Marxism, as opposed to his preferred quote-unquote respectable English social democracy. This fact did not go unnoticed by the CIA and practically every other anti-communist outlet that existed. To quote, between 1952 and 1957, from 3 sites in West Germany, a CIA operation codenamed A Dinosaur launched millions of 10-foot balloons carrying copies of George Orwell's Animal Farm and dropped them over Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, whose air forces were ordered to shoot the balloons down.
Nem fudendo que eles meteram padre do balão para poder distribuir a obra do George Orwell. Nem fudendo. Não, nem fudendo, não pode ser. A É Dinosaur. Não pode ser, velho. Nossa, mano. Será que tem alguma coisa de balloons? Não tem. Caralho, parceiro. Os caras meteram um padre do balão do George Orwell, velho. Ah, será que é isso aqui? É, the CIA slipped Animal Farm over the Iron Curtain via balloon. Caralho, velho. Porra. Aqui, né?
And dropped them over Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia.
Caralho, cara, que loucura. Porra, não, e a pior parte, você tá ali andando suave no campo, nos campos verdes da Polônia, e aí você é atingido por um livro na cabeça, e o livro é essa merda. O livro é essa merda. Porra, só piora a situação, só piora.
Even the Animal Farm film, forcibly shoved down millions of kids' throats the world over, was entirely financed by the CIA.
Opa, tá sem legenda, perdão. Voltar um pouquinho.
Of 10-foot balloons carrying copies of George Orwell's Animal Farm and dropped them over Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, whose air forces were ordered to shoot the balloons down. Even the Animal Farm film, forcibly shoved down millions of kids' throats the world over, was entirely financed by the CIA, a secret they kept for decades. It was entirely produced in Britain too, because the CIA feared that plenty of talent and animators wouldn't go along with such a blatantly anti-communist message. The very script and ending was edited to be even more negative and anti-communist afterwards, as the CIA thought it still seemed too sympathetic. All in all, Orwell was just a garbage person. Personally, politically, professionally, the human equivalent of a clogged toilet. To quote Parenti, safely ensconced
Michael Parenti, tá?
Within a virulently anti-communist society, Orwell, with Orwellian doublethink, characterized the condemnation of communism as a lonely, courageous act of defiance. Today, his ideological progeny are still at it, offering themselves as intrepid left critics of the left, waging a valiant struggle against imaginary Marxist-Leninist Stalinist hordes.
É isso, né? Quem reivindica o Orwell tem que revisar os gostos literários.
He and his ideological progeny rot like their brains often already do.
Moron Police. Muito bom, hein?
That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank
Que
you.
legal.
Preshdale, Will, Edward Hermanto, Venbug, Derek, Joseph Abud, Banana Man Ultimate, Cole Kai, Justin Burton, Work,
Caralho.
Alexander Rago, Snortsky Snorts, Tom Hissey, Phil, Abraham Fajimir Khan, Cassius,
Porra, muito bom, hein?
Unskilled Hannah, Keen
Olha.
Kevin, Halbert,
Local
Leon,
NKVD
JT Matek,
Informant.
Mott, Razzle
Caralho,
Dazzle,
quanta
and Brandon.
gente, hein?
Thanks for watching.
Muito bom, hein? Qual o canal? Ó, chama Hakim. Vou mandar pra vocês aí. E vocês viram, né? Quote Jonas Manuel. Urano Manuel. Bom demais, bom demais.